Royal Guard BREAKS SUV window, after Charlotte mouths, help me through glass. Today, she had been invited to a prestigious event, one that was surrounded by layers of security and excitement. It was a royal event, something she never thought she'd be part of, and it felt surreal to be invited to witness something so grand. She had barely managed to secure an invitation through a distant connection in her family, and now here she was, standing outside the grand venue in a beautiful dress, a mix of excitement and nerves running through her. The event was taking place in the heart of the city, and the whole area had been sealed off for the royal guests. Charlotte had never been a fan of crowds, but there was something about the atmosphere today that seemed different. The street was lined with luxury cars, and uniformed security personnel stood at every corner, watching closely for anything unusual. She felt a bit out of place in her modest attire, especially when compared to the other guests in their elegant evening wear. Her nerves were tingling, and as she made her way into the venue, she noticed the sharp, professional gaze of a royal guard nearby. He was a tall man, standing with a sense of stillness that came only from years of training. His uniform was immaculate, the red and gold of his attire standing out against the sea of dark suits and gowns. He seemed almost otherworldly to Charlotte, someone who belonged to a world far removed from her own. Inside the venue, the atmosphere was nothing short of majestic. There were chandeliers that glowed like stars, and the buzz of conversation filled the room. Charlotte tried her best to blend in, smiling politely as she was introduced to others, but her mind kept wandering. She was still not used to this kind of attention, and it made her feel uneasy. The luxurious surroundings, the chatter of the wealthy, and the proximity to the royal family all made her feel like she was living in someone else's world. But despite all the beauty and wealth around her, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the evening wore on, Charlotte found herself stepping outside for a breath of fresh air. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and for a moment she could forget about the pressure of the event. The street outside was quiet, but there were still a few people lingering nearby, security personnel, other guests, and the occasional passerby. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. A man, standing a little too close for comfort, seemed to be eyeing her from across the street. He didn't belong to the usual crowd of well-dressed guests. His clothing was darker, more ordinary, and his movements seemed too deliberate, almost as if he were trying to blend in with the crowd while keeping an eye on her. His gaze was fixed on Charlotte, and she could feel his eyes on her skin like a weight. Her heart began to race. She was no stranger to the occasional unwanted attention, but this felt different. She didn't want to make a scene or attract any more attention to herself, but the man's stare was unsettling. Every instinct in her body told her that she should move away, but she couldn't. Her feet felt like they were glued to the spot, her mind swirling with unease. She tried to look away, but the man's eyes were still locked on hers, and he hadn't moved an inch. Charlotte's mind began to race. What was he doing here? Was he simply another guest at the event, or was something more sinister happening? She quickly glanced around, hoping to see a familiar face or some sign that things were normal, but there was nothing. The security guards stationed around the area seemed too far away to notice anything unusual. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and alone. Trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping over her, Charlotte turned to step back inside, but as she took a few steps, she noticed something that stopped her dead in her tracks. The man was moving closer, his steps quickening as he crossed the street toward her. Panic surged through Charlotte's chest. This wasn't normal. He wasn't just walking past or casually glancing at her. He was coming straight toward her, her breath caught in her throat. She turned to look for help, but the security guard was nowhere in sight. The crowd inside the venue was far enough away that no one could hear her if she called out. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the occasional voice from inside the event. She felt the air growing thicker around her, and the overwhelming sense of dread threatened to suffocate her. Suddenly, the man was closer, too close. Charlotte could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on her, like a predator closing in on its prey. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her palms became clammy. What was she supposed to do? She could try to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was stuck in the middle of the street with no one around to help her. In a split second, her mind made a decision. She would have to call for help. She couldn't just stand there and wait for something terrible to happen. She needed to alert anyone, that she was in danger. But how could she do it without attracting too much attention? The man was only a few feet away now, and his cold, calculating gaze never left her. Charlotte's mind raced, and she suddenly remembered the royal guard, the man she had seen earlier standing at his post. He was nearby, stationed across the street. She had no idea if he had even noticed her before, but this was her only chance. With trembling hands, she turned toward the SUV parked nearby, hoping the glass would offer some protection. She was running out of time. In a panic, Charlotte raised her hand to the glass, her fingers lightly tapping against it, trying to draw the guard's attention. But the glass was thick, and her muffled attempts to call out for help went unnoticed. She was running out of options. She had to act fast. In a moment of desperation, Charlotte mouthed the words, "Help me," through the glass, hoping the guard would see her. Her lips formed the words carefully, her eyes locked on the guard across the street. She wasn't sure if he could see her, but she prayed that he could. She needed him to understand the urgency, to know that she was in danger, and that he was the only person who could help her. It felt like hours passed as she waited for a reaction. Her heart raced, and every second felt like an eternity. The man was closing in on her, and there was nowhere to run. It was now or never. Charlotte pressed her palms against the cold glass, staring at the royal guard. "Please," she thought, "please see me." And then, just as she was about to lose hope, something happened. The guard's eyes locked onto hers, and she saw a flicker of recognition. He had seen her silent plea. He understood. And that was all it took. The seconds that followed felt like a blur. Charlotte's heart was pounding, her breath coming in short gasps. She knew that the guard had seen her, but now everything depended on him. Would he act in time? Would he be able to save her from whatever fate awaited her? As the man continued to move closer, Charlotte held her breath, hoping that her silent cry for help would not fall on deaf ears. David, the royal guard, had been standing at his post for hours, doing what he had done countless times before. Watching, waiting, ensuring that the royal event was proceeding without any disruptions. He was accustomed to the routine, the long hours, the sharp attention to detail, and the calm precision that was required for his job. He had trained for years to become a part of the elite team assigned to such high-profile occasions, and he knew that even a single misstep could lead to disastrous consequences. Today, however, was different. There was something about the atmosphere that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the usual crowd or the opulence of the event. It was a small, nagging feeling that had begun to creep into his mind. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, moving from one guest to another, watching for any signs of trouble. The area was packed with people, and most of them were completely absorbed in the lavish celebration. But David's attention kept drifting back to a young woman standing near the SUV, her posture slightly tense, her eyes darting around nervously. David had noticed her when she first arrived. She didn't quite fit in with the rest of the guests. Her outfit was elegant, but she seemed a bit out of place, her body language betraying a sense of discomfort in the grand setting. At first, he thought it was just the natural nervousness of being in such an unfamiliar environment, but as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. From his position, he could see her clearly. Her face was a bit pale, her hands trembling slightly as she held her clutch bag. There was a certain unease about her, a tension that only someone with years of observation could pick up on. But it wasn't until he saw her glance toward the street that David's instincts kicked into overdrive. There was something in the way she looked that made him pause. As he followed her gaze, David saw a man standing on the other side of the street. The man's attire was out of place, dark and plain compared to the guests who were all dressed in their finest clothes. The man wasn't walking like someone attending a party. No, there was something deliberate in his movements, something that caught David's attention. His gaze was fixed on the woman, his eyes following her every move, and there was a coldness to his stare that immediately set off alarms in David's mind. The man was too close, too focused on her. David's training told him that something was wrong, that the woman might be in danger, but he had no way of knowing for sure. The crowd was thick. The noise of the event drowned out most of the sounds of the street, and it was nearly impossible to tell from his position whether the woman was in real distress or if it was just his heightened sense of suspicion. Still, David couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His gaze never wavered from the woman, even as he tried to remain inconspicuous. He had to be careful. He didn't want to cause a scene or overreact. But his instincts told him that this wasn't just a case of harmless nerves. There was something in the way the man moved, the way he stayed just far enough from the crowd to remain unnoticed, yet close enough to keep watching the woman. David began to move closer, casually shifting his position without drawing attention to himself. He wanted to get a better look, to observe the situation from a different angle. His eyes never left the woman. She was still standing near the SUV, her body language growing more tense by the second. Then it happened. She looked directly at David, her eyes locking onto his. In that instant, everything changed. There was a silent plea in her gaze, one that spoke louder than any words ever could. The moment their eyes met, it was as if the world slowed down, and David understood exactly what she needed: help. Her lips moved, and though the distance between them was still too far for him to hear her, David could clearly read the words she was mouthing. Help me. The simplicity of it was chilling. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't panicking. She was asking for help in the quietest, most desperate way possible. It was the kind of signal that no one would notice unless they were paying attention. And David, with his years of training, had noticed. His heart raced as he took in the situation. The man across the street hadn't moved, but there was something about his posture that made David's stomach churn. The way the man was standing, still yet intent, made it clear that he had some plan in mind, and it likely involved the woman. David's instincts screamed at him to act, but he had to be careful. There was no time for second-guessing. David's first instinct was to call for backup, but he quickly dismissed the idea. The situation was too fluid, too immediate. Waiting for more officers to arrive could be the difference between life and death for the woman. His next thought was to approach the woman directly, but the crowd made that nearly impossible without drawing attention to himself. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation. Instead, David made a snap decision. He would have to do something bold, something that would catch the man off guard, something that would make him rethink whatever plan he had in motion. He didn't know if the man was armed or if he had other accomplices in the crowd, but David couldn't wait any longer. With a quick glance at the security detail further down the street, David checked to make sure no one was watching him. Then, without wasting another second, he began to move. His strides were quick but controlled, his body moving with the fluidity of someone who had spent years in training, always ready for action. He knew that his actions could have consequences, severe consequences. But the woman's safety was all that mattered now. David closed the distance between himself and the SUV in a matter of seconds. As he approached, he saw the woman's face again, her wide eyes filled with fear but also a glimmer of hope, as if she had finally realized that someone had heard her silent cry for help. Her lips trembled, but she held steady, waiting for David's next move. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension, and as David drew closer, he made a split-second decision. He had to act fast, and there was no time to hesitate. He looked around one last time, making sure no one would see what he was about to do, and then, with a controlled motion, he moved to the SUV's window. David's hand was steady as he pulled out his baton. With a sharp, decisive motion, he slammed it against the glass, causing it to shatter with a loud crack. The sound was jarring, echoing through the quiet street as shards of glass sprayed in all directions. The woman gasped in surprise, her hand shooting up to shield her face, but David was already there, reaching inside to pull her out. In that moment, everything became a blur. There was no time to think, no time to dwell on the consequences. David had made his choice, and he was committed. The woman was now in his arms, safe for the moment, but the situation was far from over. The man across the street was still watching, still plotting, and David knew he couldn't let his guard down for even a second. As he led the woman to safety, he felt a rush of relief mixed with a nagging sense of dread. He had saved her, but the danger was far from over. The questions were piling up, and the answers would only come once they were out of harm's way. David's heart raced as he guided Charlotte away from the SUV. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of shock and confusion, but she didn't hesitate to follow him. She was trembling, but her trust in him was immediate, and that gave David a sense of calm amid the chaos that was unfolding. His hand was firm on her arm, not harsh, but steady. He knew the danger wasn't over yet, and they weren't out of the woods by any means. Charlotte's breath was shallow, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, as though she half expected the man to be following them. She was still in a daze, her mind struggling to catch up with the events that had unfolded so quickly. David could feel the weight of her fear, and it made his stomach churn. They moved quickly, weaving through the crowd of guests who were still oblivious to the gravity of the situation. The grand event around them seemed to continue as if nothing had changed. People were still mingling, laughing, and celebrating. But for David and Charlotte, the world had shifted. The loud music, the chatter, and the glittering chandeliers seemed to fade into the background as they moved further into the quiet security of the venue. David's mind raced as he considered their next move. The crowd would be a problem if they stayed in the open for too long. He needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere they could regroup and assess the situation. His eyes scanned the area, searching for a safe place. There was a side hallway nearby that led toward the security office. It was out of sight and relatively secluded. He could get Charlotte there quickly and get her some answers, as well as contact the authorities to ensure the threat was handled. "Stay close," David murmured, his voice calm but firm. Charlotte nodded, her face pale, and she clung to his side as they hurried toward the hallway. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as they passed by several closed doors. It felt like a strange contrast to the vibrant atmosphere of the main event just a few moments ago. They reached the security office, and David quickly ushered Charlotte inside. It was small and utilitarian, bare walls, a few desks, and a bank of monitors showing different parts of the venue. A couple of officers were seated at their desks, but when they saw David, they immediately stood up, sensing that something was wrong. "David, what's going on?" one of the officers asked, his voice tense. David didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He turned to Charlotte, who was standing just inside the door, still trying to make sense of everything. "There's been a security breach," David said in a low voice. "I need you to make sure the rest of the perimeter is secure. There's a man who was targeting her. He was too close for comfort." Charlotte, still too stunned to speak, glanced at the officers and then back at David. She wanted to say something, but her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't find the words to express the terror she had felt just moments ago. The sheer uncertainty of it all weighed heavily on her, and the adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving a hollow feeling in its place. David's tone softened as he turned to her, noticing how shaken she was. "You're safe now, Charlotte, I promise," he said. It wasn't a guarantee that she could rely on, but it was the only comfort he could offer her in the moment. The officers immediately began to make phone calls, contacting their supervisors and security teams. David stayed close to Charlotte, keeping a watchful eye on her as she sank into a chair in the corner. She looked like she might faint, but he could see that she was trying to stay composed. She was strong, he could tell, even if she didn't feel it at that moment. "I don't know what happened," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. She ran a shaky hand through her hair, her eyes unfocused as though she were still stuck in the moment outside. I don't even know how to explain what I saw." David nodded, his gaze steady as he watched the officer's work. "You don't have to explain it now. Take your time. But you did the right thing. You sent me a signal. You made sure someone saw you. And that's how we got here." Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if you hadn't seen me? What if he—" David shook his head, cutting her off gently. "We're not going to think about what-ifs. We're here now, and that's what matters. You're safe, and that's all that matters." Charlotte nodded slowly, her chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. The weight of the situation still hadn't fully hit her. It was as if she were in a daze, her brain struggling to process everything that had happened in such a short amount of time. She had been moments away from being alone with someone who, from the way he had acted, was clearly not someone to be trusted. The fear, the uncertainty, it all felt too surreal to comprehend. David watched her carefully, noting the way she still seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. He knew that it would take time for her to fully understand the gravity of what had almost happened. But for now, all he could do was make sure she was safe, make sure she felt like she could breathe again. He turned back to the officers who were still talking in hushed tones. "Is the perimeter secure?" he asked. "We're getting everything locked down now," one of the officers replied. "We've contacted the local authorities and the royal team. They're on their way." David nodded in satisfaction. "Good, let me know as soon as we have an update." As he turned back to Charlotte, he saw her eyes following him. She was looking at him as if she were trying to understand something, but he didn't know what it was. She was still processing everything, still dealing with the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. I'm sorry, Charlotte said suddenly, her voice trembling. I shouldn't have. David held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't apologize, you did nothing wrong, you did everything right. You kept your head when it mattered most. She met his gaze, her eyes flickering with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there, she admitted, her voice quiet. David could only offer a small, reassuring smile. He didn't need to say anything more. The words wouldn't have been enough. What mattered was that he had acted when he needed to, and now Charlotte was safe. That was all that mattered to him. As the minutes passed, the officers worked quickly, organizing security and preparing for the arrival of the authorities. David's job was far from over, but for the moment he could focus on the fact that he had made the right decision. He had saved Charlotte, and for now that was enough. Charlotte sat in the chair, still quiet, still processing. David gave her some space, but he never strayed far. He remained close, ready to help her whenever she was ready to talk. He knew that the next few hours would be important, Charlotte would need support, and the investigation would need to be thorough. But in that moment, as the tension slowly began to ease, David allowed himself a moment of relief. They had made it through the worst of it, but David's mind wasn't completely at ease. He couldn't shake the image of the man standing across the street, staring at Charlotte. The situation wasn't over yet. There were still unanswered questions, and he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows. But for now, he focused on Charlotte, making sure she knew she was safe, that she was no longer alone. And that, at least, was one small victory. As the minutes passed, Charlotte slowly began to regain her composure. The initial shock of the situation had started to wear off, but the sense of unease remained. She sat quietly in the corner of the security office, her hands still trembling slightly as she fidgeted with the hem of her dress. She had been through so much in such a short amount of time, and the weight of it all was beginning to settle in. David stayed by her side, watching her carefully, though he didn't want to crowd her. He knew she needed space to process what had happened, but at the same time, he wanted her to know that he was there for her. She had gone through something traumatic, and although she hadn't fully understood the gravity of the situation at first, David could see that it was starting to sink in. The officers had finished securing the area, and the Royal Security Team was on its way. David had made sure to notify them of the situation, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the authorities to arrive. The minutes felt like hours as Charlotte sat silently, lost in her thoughts. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the security monitors, as the officers continued to make calls and send updates. David tried to make small talk with the officers to pass the time, but his mind kept drifting back to Charlotte. He couldn't stop thinking about the man who had been following her, about the look in his eyes as he had watched her from across the street. There was something about the whole situation that felt off, something that made David's instincts tell him that the danger wasn't over yet. But for now, all he could do was stay vigilant and wait for the authorities to take control. Charlotte's voice broke the silence. It was soft, barely above a whisper, but it was enough to get David's attention. "Why did he target me?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion and a hint of fear. David turned to her, surprised by the question. He had been so focused on keeping her safe that he hadn't even considered whether or not she had any idea of why she had been targeted. "I don't know," David replied honestly, his voice calm but filled with a hint of uncertainty. "I don't have all the answers right now, but we'll figure it out. I'm sure the authorities will get to the bottom of this." Charlotte nodded slowly, but it was clear that the uncertainty was eating away at her. She was still processing the events, still trying to make sense of it all. She had been living an ordinary life just hours ago, and now she was caught up in something that felt like a nightmare. "I just don't understand," she continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I was just standing there trying to get some air, and then everything changed. I felt like I was being watched, like something was wrong. And then I saw him, standing across the street just watching me. I didn't know what to do." David could hear the distress in her voice, the anxiety that was creeping in as the reality of what had almost happened began to set in. She wasn't just shaken by the events of the evening. She was struggling to understand how something so unsettling could have happened to her. And David knew that understanding was the first step in healing. "You did the right thing," David said reassuringly, his tone steady. "You saw something wasn't right and you did what you needed to do. You sent me that signal. You got my attention, and that's what mattered." Without that, we don't know how it would have gone down. You were strong, Charlotte." She looked at him, and for the first time since the event began, she seemed to relax a little. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and she took a deep breath. "I didn't know what else to do," she said quietly. "I felt like I was going crazy, like no one would believe me if I told them, but you saw me, you heard me." David nodded, giving her an encouraging smile. "You weren't crazy, Charlotte. You knew something was off, and that's why you acted. Not everyone would have done what you did. You didn't just wait for something to happen. You took control of the situation, and that's why you're safe now." Charlotte's eyes glistened, and for a moment David thought she might cry. But instead she took a deep breath, nodding in silent gratitude. The conversation was interrupted when the door to the security office opened, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. They were part of the local law enforcement team, and David could tell by the serious expressions on their faces that they had been briefed on the situation. "David," one of the officers said, "we've got a few questions for you and the lady here. We need to get a statement from both of you before we move forward with the investigation." David nodded, motioning for Charlotte to stand. He wanted to be there for her, to make sure she felt supported through this next part of the ordeal. She was still visibly shaken, but she stood up, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her dress. "It's okay," David said softly, his voice calm. "I'll be right here with you." Charlotte nodded, but didn't say anything as the officers led them to another room where they could give their statements. It was a small, plain room with a few chairs and a table, and it smelled faintly of coffee. As they sat down, David gave Charlotte a reassuring look, but his mind was still elsewhere. He couldn't help but feel that there was more to this situation than met the eye. The officers asked them both to recount everything they could remember. Charlotte was still clearly overwhelmed, but she did her best to explain the situation. How she had felt uncomfortable in the crowd, how the man had been watching her, how she had made eye contact with David and mouthed the words, "Help me." David was asked to confirm his side of the story, which he did without hesitation. He explained how he had seen Charlotte's signal, how he had acted quickly to get to her, and how he had broken the window to rescue her. As the officers took notes, David's mind kept racing. There was something about the man who had been following Charlotte that didn't sit right with him. The way he had moved, the way he had watched her, it wasn't random. It felt calculated, like he had been planning this for some time. David couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, and he knew that they needed to get to the bottom of it as soon as possible. After a few more minutes of questioning, the officers excused themselves, saying they would need some time to review the information and check with the other security teams. They left David and Charlotte alone in the room, and the silence that followed felt heavy. David looked at Charlotte, who was staring down at her hands, her face pale. "You okay?" he asked gently. Charlotte nodded, though she didn't look up. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think so." David could see that she was still processing everything, still trying to wrap her head around the fact that she had been targeted. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to be in her shoes, to suddenly have your life turned upside down by something you couldn't control. But he was certain of one thing: Charlotte had shown incredible strength, and no matter what came next, she was going to get through this. For now, all they could do was wait. But as the minutes stretched on, David couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the danger wasn't truly over yet. Something told him that they had only just begun to uncover the truth behind what had really happened that night.